In November 1958, Australia's tallest office building became ready for occupation after a construction period of 2 years. The story behind the design and building of these new offices is a fascinating one. As this new building reaches for the sky, it becomes known affectionately as the Glass House, the building which marks a great step forward in architecture.
It's a bit like if you're on an old Bakelite telephone and all of a sudden someone hands you an iPhone. Pretty alien, and somewhat possibly even threatening for a lot of people.
These are extraordinary, aren't they?
Like you've got, the progress of the building under construction, so ahead of its time.
We're fortunate enough to not only have clearly the building exists, but these photographs.
Look at that context. There's nothing else of that scale in sight.
And even though the context of the city around this building has changed so much, it still has this kind of wonderful presence, where the Hoddle grid just kind of shifts and it really marks this place. When you're kind of walking towards the building from the centre of the city, you see it almost kind of emerge from behind Parliament, and you see the way the light reflects off its facade, and I think it really owns its place.
I think if you don't know what you're looking for, you probably perceive it to be just another glass building.
I think that first impression of it being just an old building, I think quickly starts to dissolve as you get closer to it.
When I first came to the building, it felt really special. It was kind of like finding a piece of Featherston furniture. It was very Mad Men, There's a timeless quality to it as well.
I've always had a great sense of affinity to the building for as long as really I can remember. My grandfather was an architect and he was a modernist. I know from family tales that he would bring the family on excursions on a weekend to look at this incredible tower going up.
People would come every single day to watch the progress on the building. Can you imagine today when buildings are being built, having crowds watching? It doesn't happen. But that was the importance of this building in Melbourne or Australia as well.
Weren't your grandparents one of the 20,000 people who visited in the first week?
Everyone who saw this being built, they could the first of the open houses, if you like, come and have a look at this.
I'm sure a lot of people would have been very confronted by this. They would have been, it would have been a significant departure or change to what they were used to.
It had mixed reception by the general public, but that's not surprising because when you think about it, that's the role of progressive architecture. It's to push those boundaries and it's to challenge the status quo.
Because it would have represented the world coming to Melbourne, or progress, or what was to come.
Okay, let me show you why this building is so special. First and foremost, it had to work brilliantly as one beautiful, unencumbered floor plate, and it meant that every single person within the building was no further than about 8.5 metres from daylight. So you could have a totally open floor environment, or you could run a series of offices along the perimeter and cut that floor plate up wherever it was required. So what he did was he very cleverly took his core, which holds the lift cars, and he took it off the side of the building and set it to the side. And offset cores have become so popular again today. If you create this stair and you put it in a place where people will use it, then you also get informal conversations going on. And that stair was located in that gap between the tower and the core. And in that location, the floor-to-ceiling glass, which meant that every time you went up and down that stair, you get these wonderful views and vistas out. In fact, you got these uninterrupted views. So the building, 19 levels, up on pilotis, columns, and about halfway up was originally about as high as you were permitted to go. That was that 132-foot height limit. Up here, the cafeteria level, you had lunch every day with Melbourne's very finest view. And the executives were appropriately below you. He was very interested in creating architecture that was about people. But more importantly, it was about that every single person who worked in this building was treated equally. And I think it would have just been a delightful building to have worked in. There would have been nothing comparable like it at all in all of Melbourne.
We're now in the entry from Albert Street, which actually used to be the car park of the building when it was first constructed. In this space, you'd notice some interesting design features like this beautiful Inga King sculpture behind me. It really has a sense of movement that ushers you through the space. These lovely details that you'd find throughout, utilizing natural materials and finishes wherever you interacted with the building. From this space, you're really kind of pushed through to the core of the building. And as you can see here, most primary journeys through the building are curated so that they're punctuated with moments of nature. In this case, we have a landscape garden at the end of the lift core lobby. You can see that there's a sense of verticality in all the design features within this space, and that includes how the walls really move up past the ceiling plane, giving you a sense of departure of movement vertically through the building. We're now on level 18 of the building, and we're currently standing in a threshold space that bridges the link between the core of the building and the main floor plate. You can see the core walls coming into the space from the outside. And from this point, you can actually get a really close view of the famous curtain wall facade of the building. This is actually the northern elevation, so it features these sunshade hoods of brise soleil to protect the building from harsh northern sunlight. In order to clean these windows, you actually invented these very peculiar building maintenance units that you used to have to climb into through the sash just to clean the facade. So on the top floor of the building, when it first opened, there was a cafeteria. Today, it's a co-working space where you can still come up to have a fantastic coffee. One of the lovely features of this space is actually this staircase, which has nice sculptural timber handrail. It's very kind of Scandinavian modernist. I invite you to come and have a look. It's a bit intimidating, but that takes you all the way from basement levels up to the rooftop of the building. Essentially, as you enter the floor plate from level by level, you're always presented with the view out. But more importantly, it encourages people to use the stairs to travel between different floors. If you get an opportunity to come and have a tour of the building, I highly recommend it, especially during open house.
So it might be hard to imagine looking at the Melbourne CBD skyline as it stands today. But before this building was built in 1958, there was a very strict height limit of 132 feet. It was the limit of the fire brigade's ladders and how far their hoses and water would reach. Also at the time, the fire brigade station, which was not too far away from here, had complete uninterrupted views of the surrounding area. And there was a lot of resistance to exceed the 132-foot height limit. The way Bates Smart got around that at 1 Nicholson Street was by building outside the CBD grid, not utilising the entire site, introducing sprinklers to the building, and also providing the Melbourne Fire Brigade with the highest point of the building to use as an observation deck. The impact that this one building had at the time was immense. It really shaped the Melbourne CBD skyline.
As an interior designer, I've always liked the garden. Yeah. What does that say? I've always loved the way the garden and these early photos, again, of the stair. You know, the stair becomes such a feature, but the garden, the attempt to float the garden in and out of the building.
That incredible generosity that the building had to the public through its garden, and not occupying the whole site, but actually giving that back into the public realm.
Wellness outlook. Kind of lost it in some parts of the late 20th century, didn't we? And we're going back to the very things that were set by this building.
Absolutely, there's great lessons to learn here.
100-person theaterette, there was a bank, there was a rooftop garden.
There was car parking on the ground floor, there were elevators, there was air conditioning.
There was a rec room with things like table tennis tables. There was a library.
And the importance of the first cup of coffee in the morning. That's definitely. Look at that, you go, still that's extraordinary. 1958. But I think Australians have always been outward looking, always, I think, taken from the best, gathered it up, examined it, maybe reinvented it in a way that suits us, that suits the way we are, that suits our environment.
So there were a number of buildings that led the path or led the way for 1 Nicholson Street to be realised. I think the one that I think is probably most influential was probably the Ministry of Education building in Rio de Janeiro. There was a very close relationship between the landscape and the architecture.
This building was really representing this kind of shift in Australia. It obviously followed the Olympic Games. It expressed this kind of modernist, progressive view. And it probably shook off perhaps the shackles of Mother England in a way and really looked to other examples in the world. So it was absolutely this extraordinary moment.
Isn't it interesting how an inanimate object can make you feel sort of that way about a thing? At the end of the day, it's just bricks and mortar, but everything that carries it represents the stories that it tells.
This story is a very hopeful story, and it shows how a building can make a really important engineering, built, architectural, civic, cultural contribution to the city, and I think that's something we can all celebrate.
Here we are, 60 years later. Well, I hope that it represents exactly what we should be doing with every building that we build for tomorrow.
We want it to be here for a long time to come, so we need to make sure that everything we do is done really, really well and will stand the test of time. So that's important to us.
Well, I hope that 1 Nicholson remains its charming self well into the future.
And there was a fish tank on the executive level, and one of the stories I love about the fish tank was the fish tank was at the end of the executive area, and as the building moved, because it was a tall building, you could see the water line against the top, and that was apparently quite disconcerting. And the story goes that they went back to the architects to Sorosga, we have a problem, the building's moving, you need to fix that. And his conclusion was the easiest thing to do was to put a piece of black masking tape across the water line, and you no longer saw the water move, which was the equivalent of the 1 penny solution as opposed to the stabilise the building.